All right, Chapter 20, Section 2, Revolutions of 1830, 1848. What were the causes and the effects of the revolutions in Europe in the 1830s and 1848? So again, if you think back to the previous section, there's a variety of factors that are at play here. You've got conservatives who are trying to go back to the old way of doing things, and they're trying to slow things up, and they're not wanting too much change. You've got the liberals who are pushing for pretty substantial changes. Constitutions look like the United States, guarantee free speech, those types of things. And then you've got this growing call of nationalism. And so these things are all under the surface and kind of boiling. So we're going to look at some of the ways that French rebels are going to get some reforms, how the spirit of reform is going to spread throughout Europe, and then the revolutions that surged through France and the rest of Europe in 1848. So when we look at citizens and the July Revolution, what you have is you have Louis XVIII, I believe, who comes back after Napoleon and is reestablished, and he agrees to a limited monarchy. And so France has a king, but it also has a constitution. And when Louis XVIII is done, then Charles X comes back becomes king. And what you're looking at is that Charles wants to, well, he rejects this idea of this French charter. He doesn't want limited monarchy. He doesn't want a constitution. As far as he's concerned, he's a divine right king kind of guy. And what you get is you get liberals and radicals throughout France who say, whoa, 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 we've been there, we've done that. We didn't go through this whole French Revolution just so we could go back to the way it was before, because that didn't work either. And so pretty quickly Charles X realizes that his time is probably pretty limited, and so he decides to get the heck out of Dodge before people get too ticked off and maybe end up chopping his head off. I doubt that would have happened, but you can see where the past is probably weighing kind of heavily on him. And what ends up happening is this bourgeoisie middle class seeks out Louis Philippe. So when Louis Philippe comes in, he's going to take the title of Citizen King, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. One of the things to point out here is if we look at Charles X, here is how Charles X dresses, kind of old style, monarchy style. Louis Philippe is dressing in a more modern style. So that goes to show you how this shift is going to take place and what it's going to look like. So Louis Philippe, the Citizen King, the reason he takes on the nickname Citizen King is not because he didn't want the awesome, the terrific, the great, like maybe some other people take on. What he really wants to do is he wants to clearly highlight this point right here, that the king rules by the will of the people, the citizens, not by the will of God. And because moderate liberals pick him, and he's a friend of the bourgeoisie, and he's kind of an easygoing guy anyway, he likes to hang out with people and talk to people, he's very personable, all of those make him a very well-liked figure. And so things are going to go along pretty well with him until a little bit later on when things get a little crazy in France again. So if we look at some reforms that succeed and some forms that don't succeed, Belgium's able to win their independence. The problem Belgium runs into is they were thrown into a country with the Dutch. And the Dutch and the Belgians are very different from each other. The Dutch are Protestants. They're involved in trade. And whereas Belgium is mostly Roman Catholic, they're involved in manufacturing. They speak French. So even linguistically, these places are different from each other. And so when Belgium does move to win independence, the rest of Europe is fairly supportive of that because they realize there are some key differences. And they also realize that there may be some advantages for them in Belgium gaining their independence and the Dutch being independent. And so when you think about how some of these rebellions are crushed, sometimes they're supported, like for example with Greece and with Belgium. Poland, on the other hand, is one that fails. And there's a couple of lessons in Poland for people who are pushing revolution. Poland doesn't really have this strong, cohesive idea of what they want to gain besides independence. They want to come back onto the map as an independent Poland, but they have lots of groups who, outside of wanting to become Poland again, they're not going to work with each other afterwards. And so, because these rebels don't gain widespread support from everyone in Poland, and they're kind of working against each other in some instances, it never gives them the ability to be a very successful revolution. And then on top of that, Russian forces are brought in, and they don't want to see Poland become independent. They want to continue to hang on to Poland, and so they are able to crush that independence movement and block efforts from being able to do it. So when we last left off, Louis Philippe was in power, and things are going to go along pretty well until 1848. The radicals are calling for even more changes than there were before, especially this growing working class within France, who really are outside of that upper class, middle upper class bourgeoisie. And so they're wanting changes that help benefit the workers, everyday workers. Another factor comes in that there is a recession that hits, and it makes it tough for people to buy food and bread and all those types of things again. And so, with the call for more changes and then this economic downturn, it adds all the fuel that you need for something to happen. And the moment the government begins to limit free speech because they're tired of hearing the radicals complain, and they're tired of hearing about the recession, and they're tired of hearing the critics, so they smack down on the free press and free speech, and that mobilizes the people, and they come out and they're able to overthrow and create a second republic. One of the problems that the second republic runs into is it lacks unity. And so we really see that in the June days of this French revolt in 1848, because the working class wanted a lot of these changes to help support them financially, which is what these workshops were. And it was a way of providing kind of social welfare to help the working class. Well, the middle class resented using their wealth to pay for these workshops and the taxes that were associated with it. The peasants were afraid that the workers wanted to create a socialist system where they would take the farmers' lands and the peasants would be thrown off. And so what you get is these groups, these factions splitting apart and fighting against each other. And that's what happens in the June days. With all of that craziness and chaos, what many people want is to go back to normal again, to some stability. And that's where a new Napoleon comes to power. Napoleon is popular with both the liberals, the conservatives, and maybe even a little bit, maybe the radicals. The reason he is supported by conservatives is they see this as a move back to the glory days of France, when under Napoleon, France ruled Europe. And so for conservatives, they see this as a good move back to when France was at its height, when it was at its power. For liberal bourgeoisie, they see him being a good move because he is going to bring stability. He is going to bring the ability for the economy to get back on its feet again and to kind of get things going. And it's going to prevent the far left radicals from totally upheaving the whole system. And just like his uncle, what he does is he has a plebiscite. He gives all adult men the right to vote. So that goes from like 200,000 people being able to vote to someone like 9 million. Not that you need to know that, but there's a huge increase in the number of people who are going to vote. And then when he has the plebiscite, all of these new voters are probably going to vote for him because he gave them the right to vote. So anyway, France gets all crazy. They get back to where they started in the first place. That's kind of the theme here. So with these movements that are happening in the 1830s and 1848, you're going to see these revolutions sweep through. And so the Austrian Empire has all of these nationalistic groups that are fighting for independence. So there's changes in the Austrian Empire. There's revolts in Italy and German states to try and gain some sense of autonomy. And what that's going to do is eventually it's going to lead to Italy and Germany becoming modern countries here pretty soon. But essentially, what's happening with these surges throughout Europe is, in general, people around the world all want the same thing. They want to be able to believe what they believe. They want to be able to say what they want to say, short of hurting other people. They want freedom of press. They want all of these really basic human rights, and they want a government that makes sure that those are protected. And what's happening is the people in Europe in the 1840s feel like their governments aren't providing that. What happened in the Arab Spring beginning in 2010, 2011, that swept through the Middle East is the same thing. They believe that their governments aren't protecting their basic human rights. And so it goes from one country to another country to another country as they raise up the call and say, if you can't give us these rights, then we want to get rid of you and get a government that will. Now, eventually, these revolutions, both in 1848 and the Arab Spring, fail. The reason they fail, there's a handful of reasons. One is the governments have control over the military. And so when you have these revolutions taking place, the military is able to come in and squash them. The other problem you run into is that these groups want change, but outside of that, for example, when we go to the French Revolution, the radicals and the liberals don't see eye to eye on what that change looks like. So even though you have these revolutions, afterwards, a lot of times they go to war against each other and they have a civil war trying to create the country that they want them. So they lack mass support, they lack unity. And the other thing you see is these constitutions, the governments withdraw them, replace them, rewrite them to kind of their benefit. And so the government and the rulers have an awful lot of power in terms of the constitutions, being able to change those things and rewrite the rules, and they have the support of the military. And a lot of times that's why they fail. But along with those, the failure creates a refugee crisis. So with the Syrian and the Arab Spring, there's a great deal of refugees who are fleeing the country either because they protested against the government or they lost the revolution and they fear for their lives. The other thing, and the same thing happened in Europe in the 1840s, is then they leave the country and they try and find a new place to live. And in the 1840s, the United States provided an opportunity for those people of the losing ends of revolutions to come here. And currently the world isn't as receptive.